Thank you for being here at today's event, Wonderland Curious Nature Symposium, with the gardening experts, Ambra Edwards and Keith Wiley. I'm Jamie Boyer, the Vice President for Education. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the New York Botanical Garden is located on the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. In addition to today's program, the New York Botanical Garden offers many classes, workshops, public lectures in landscape design, floral design, gardening, and many, many more. I'd like to highlight a few of the upcoming events for the folks in the audience. We have the new Plant Studio classes that launch this week. Dig into gardening, botany, floral design, landscaping design, and many more with the comfort to do it at your own pace, whenever it fits your schedule, whenever you are located in the world. On June 13th, we'll host a book tour talk in the Mertz Library. The Tulip Garden, Polly Nicholson in conversation with Lindsay Taylor, followed by a special workshop on seasonal bulbs. Our School of Professional Horticulture, going for over 90 years, is accepting applications for the next incoming class. Get your applications in by August 1st. And finally, registration is still open for our summer intensive programs in floral design, gardening, landscape design, and therapeutic horticulture. I'll now invite Jennifer Bernstein, our CEO and William Steer President of the New York Botanical Garden, to the stage. Jennifer's commitment to our scientific horticulture and educational programs makes events like this possible. Jennifer.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for introducing this event today. And I want to acknowledge Jamie has been at the garden for 26 years and was just recently promoted into his new position as Vice President for Education. So we're very grateful to everything Jamie does. It's my pleasure to be here this morning to introduce our very special guests, garden writer and historian Ambra Edwards and garden designer Keith Wiley. Ambra Edwards discovered her love of gardens and garden history while researching ways to transform and care for her own suburban garden. She soon realized the potential for expression and storytelling in the art and the act of gardening. She's a prolific writer, and Ambra's work has appeared in The Telegraph, The Guardian, Country Living, Gardens Illustrated, The English Garden, and Hortus. Her books include Head Gardeners, The Story of the English Garden, The Story of Gardening, with co-author Penelope Hobhouse, and The Plant Hunter's Atlas. She's earned the Garden Media Guild Journalist of the Year Award in 2006, 2009, and 2015, and the Garden Media Inspirational Book of the Year Award in 2017 for Head Gardeners. This morning, Ambra will take us on a journey through time with the story of the English garden, tracing its history from the Middle Ages to today. Our second speaker, Keith Wiley, has been described as a maverick and the horticultural equivalent of a firebrand preacher for his unique approach to garden design. Keith has documented this approach in his books On the Wildside, Shade, and Designing and Planting a Woodland Garden. In 2004, in an exhibit at the National Portrait Gallery, Keith was recognized for his achievements in shaping our ideas about nature, gardens, and the world of plants. Today, Keith will take us on a tour of his beloved Wildside, one of the most exciting and innovative gardens in Britain. The plantings and designs are inspired by Keith's travels around the world, South African savannas, the Colorado Rockies, Swiss alpine meadows, and New England roadsides. Please join me in welcoming Ambra Edwards and Keith Wiley.
Hello, and thank you for coming. The history of the English garden wiggles around a lot. It's not that straight. So our festival today takes inspiration from Alice in Wonderland. the story of a splendidly fearless little girl who has a series of weird and wonderful adventures as she tries to enter a beautiful locked garden. Now, this is the real Alice Liddell, photographed by the author Lewis Carroll. But what kind of garden was Carroll imagining worthy of such efforts on Alice's part? Probably not Alice's actual garden, the Deanery Garden at Christ Church College, Oxford, which seems to have been a rather dreary expanse of lawn devoted to the fashionable new game of croquet. But it did have a door which led into another garden into which Alice was not allowed. Now, that door is still there, and you're still not allowed through it. Could he have been thinking of the typical suburban garden of the period, full of urns and balustrades and day-glow bedding plants? But these were features that rarely made it into Oxford and Cambridge college gardens. Or something altogether more quirky. Seems more Lewis Carrollish, doesn't it? But Lewis Carroll, whose real name was Charles Dodgson, was an Oxford mathematician, and I think he would have loved this garden, inspired by mathematical formulas. And it was created about a century after his death by Maggie Keswick and Charles Jenks. But we think he was inspired by something closer to home, the Master's Garden at Christ Church, where he lived, that he could see from his windows. Or perhaps the beautiful gardens of Merton College, just down the lane, which inspired another great writer for children, C.S. Lewis, author of the Narnia Chronicles. He would certainly have known that Oxford's quads conceal all kinds of surprises. This is another garden at Merton that visitors don't generally see. You can see it's completely exotic. We know that he and Alice visited the Botanic Garden at Oxford, now a centre for cutting-edge research, but also the perfect spot for a dreamy picnic on the river, which is where the story began. The fact is, for as long as gardens have fed our bellies, they have also fed our imaginations. And I'm confining myself to English gardens today, but in every garden culture, from the serene Zen gardens of 14th century Japan to the nightmarish figures of Bomarzo in Italy, from the Islamic Chahar Bagh to the great landscape gardens of the English 18th century, gardens have embodied hopes, dreams, beliefs, aspirations. They're portholes to other times. They tell us what the people who made them valued, what they believed to be cutting edge or exotic or beautiful. And as those ideas change, the concept of what a garden could and should be changes also. So the first English gardens we know very much about were the medieval monasteries. Now, these were huge institutions, almost like small villages, supporting large communities of monks and lay brothers, looking after the poor and the sick, offering hospitality to travellers. So they needed to be self-sufficient, to provide not only vast quantities of food, including fish for all the fast days, but medicines for the infirmary, domestic items such as soaps and dyes, and also plants required for worship, such as the roses and lilies associated with the Virgin. So while they would certainly have been decorative, they were primarily functional gardens. The iris, for example, was grown not for its beauty, but for its value as a primitive deodorant. But the most important garden was this one, the cloister garth, just an austere square of plain green grass, intended as an aid to contemplation. It was also supposed to refresh the encloistered eyes of the monks who spent many hours copying manuscripts, so it offered both spiritual and physical benefits. Now, crucially, you'll see that this garden is completely enclosed. Which brings us to the important medieval idea of the hortus conclusus, the garden as an enclosed sanctuary. Now, this is an idea that has a religious dimension as a symbol of both the Virgin and Mother Church, but also a secular one, the garden is a major theme in medieval poetry and song, as both a symbol of and a place for love. If we look at the trellises and the bowers, they're ideal for keeping out prying eyes. This is an illustration of Chaucer's Knight's Tale. So right from the start, we see how the garden is inseparable from narrative. And the overwhelming narrative of the time is that of courtly love. Now, this is a concept that emerged in the feudal courts of the south of France early in the 12th century. It's the subject of the songs of the wandering troubadours. It's what gives us the legends of King Arthur and Lancelot and Guinevere. And the most influential expression of courtly love was Le Roman de la Rose, a French allegorical poem translated into English by Chaucer, which was the nearest thing to a medieval bestseller. And in it, a lover, amant, travels through an allegorical garden, searching for a special rose which symbolizes his lady's love. And it's a quest story, so in a way, it's not unlike Alice. However, eventually, as we see here, Lady Idleness leads Amant through a locked door to his love. So even pre-Freud, that symbolism is fairly obvious. So if we return to Emilia, we see how the garden at this time is this very intimate, very feminine space, very tiny, tucked within the castle walls. And the first people in England to build beyond those walls are the Tudors in the 15th century, making gardens designed to reflect the power and prestige of their makers. So that totally changes the nature of the garden. So it's no longer a haven, a place to get away from noisy, smelly men, but it's a public statement. It's meant to dazzle, even to intimidate. And this is a garden made to entertain Elizabeth I. Now, while her father, Henry VIII, had spent lavishly on his gardens, Elizabeth was more canny. So instead of spending her own money, she would make these annual progresses throughout the land in which courtiers vied with each other to build ever more spectacular gardens in which to welcome her. And this is one of them. This is Kenilworth, built in 1575, reconstructed in 2009, and it was built by the Earl of Leicester as a venue for a party that lasted no less than 19 days in this last-ditch attempt to secure her hand. What this shows us is how gardens can be made to send coded messages. So we see here the eglantine roses that are the personal symbol of Elizabeth. There are orbs, symbols of the wisdom and authority of the monarch, held aloft on these obelisks, symbolizing death and eternity. So taken together, they express a wish for the eternal life of the monarch. But what you cannot miss in this garden is its very obvious phallic intent. Not least in this fountain, in which the globe is held aloft by these Muxley Atlas figures. We have the orb, and sitting on top of it, well, not sitting, erect on top of it, is the ragged staff, which is the personal symbol of the Earl of Leicester, and it's spurting water out of the top. So perhaps not the subtlest of hints to the Virgin Queen. So I think it's actually rather hideous. And Elizabeth obviously thought so too, because she cast him off. And, no, she didn't marry him. She had nothing more to do with him after this. So probably the garden of love we all know best is the Taj Mahal. But in the English tradition, I think it's hard to beat this one, Elveston Castle, which was begun round about the time that Lewis Carroll was born. In the 1830s, the fourth Earl Harrington scandalised polite society by marrying his long-standing mistress, the actress Maria Foote. And The couple were ostracised. They retreated to Elverston in Derbyshire, where he set about making his bride what he called the biggest wedding present in the world, a garden made on a theme of chivalric love. And his gardener, William Barron, perfected the art of moving these enormous trees and shrubs so that he was able to create, within just 20 years, a mature landscape of secret walks and gilded bowers, picturesque rockwork, and elaborate themed gardens like this, all enclosed by 11 miles of impenetrable evergreen hedges. And entry was barred to everyone but the Queen, Queen Victoria, who never came. So it was the ultimate stage set for this actress, for their mutual drama of love, providing all the poetic, courtly settings that it deserved. Even the servants were made to dress up in medieval costumes. But if we return to the 16th century, we saw at Kenilworth how a garden could be made to send these coded messages, and Dodgson loved puzzles. So he would have adored this 16th century Tudor garden in Northamptonshire because it's pretty much a three-dimensional Sudoku puzzle. But there's an added edge to this unfinished garden called Lyveden New Bield, in that making it was so dangerous. It was built by a Catholic, Sir Thomas Tresham, as a protest against the Protestant establishment and a symbol of his Catholic faith at a time of persecution. He spent no less than 12 years either in jail or under house arrest. So the garden is full of religious symbolism. It rises through 7 levels, representing the Stations of the Cross. There were 7 at that time, not 14 as we have now. There was a mount in the centre, recalling Calvary. And the building itself is a number puzzle, employing multiple variations of the numbers of 7 and 5, which are numbers associated with the Passion of Christ, the 5 wounds of Christ, the 7 sorrows of Mary, strongly associated by the Catholics at this time with their own persecution. And so this building was probably intended for the secret celebration of the Mass, which was punishable by death. You see, it has no roof. The garden was never finished. It stands as it was left on the 11th of September, 1605, when Tresham died, and his workmen downed tools. His son never inherited. He was implicated in the gunpowder plot and executed. So this garden was just lost for 4 centuries. And something that perplexed historians when the garden was rediscovered in the 1990s was this island garden. You see, it's completely surrounded by a moat. And nobody quite knew what it was for until 2003, when in a local archive were discovered a set of Luftwaffe reconnaissance photos taken in 1944, which revealed this labyrinthine pattern in the ground. Now, this labyrinth has been reconstructed, but we now know from archaeological evidence that Tresham planted here a fruit labyrinth of roses and raspberries to represent the difficult path through this earthly life, guided not by a thread, but by the grace of God. And fruit would go on to take on additional qualities during the English Civil War and the interregnum that followed it. So what we have to remember is that it is still possible at this time to imagine a garden where all known plants could be grown, not for much longer, but still at this time. So for the garden makers of 17th century England, Eden was a fact. And it was perfectly reasonable to try to recreate it. So making a garden expresses both a political and religious aspiration. But during the time of the Commonwealth, an ornamental garden is seen as a wicked indulgence. So instead, growing fruit becomes a devotional act. Fruit is proof of the liberality of God, and a well-kept orchard is the sign of an orderly household, a humble and devout heart, and a carefully tended soul. And there was a divine called Ralph Austin who wrote this enormous treatise on fruit. But crucially it begins, "The world is a great library, and fruit trees are some of the books wherein we may read and plainly see the attributes of God." However, when Charles II returned to Britain in 1660, he had learned the lessons of power from his cousin, Louis XIV, in France, where he had been sheltering. And he has a very different and entirely secular vision for the garden. So this is the royal garden he made at Campden Court. It's all canals and avenues in the manner of Versailles. It's a statement of authority. Nature is man's to command. Don't mess with me, I'm the king. So to a large extent, gardens have always been political statements. We cannot divorce them from the political and economic tides which shape them. So as soon as the Stuart dynasty is ousted in Britain and replaced by a king from the Netherlands, ambitious men promptly start making gardens in the Dutch style, like this. This tapestry depicts one made at Stoke Edith in Herefordshire in 1699. But it's an idea of the garden that's already on its way out, because even as this tapestry is being woven around 1710, one William Kent is on his way to Rome. So within just one generation, gardens change from this to this. This is Kent's masterwork at Rauschen, made in 1737. So what we're seeing is a movement from a decorative borrowing of some of the architectural forms of the Renaissance to a total immersion in classical literature and philosophy, which creates a whole new language for garden making in England. So we have a phrase in England, gardening leave. I don't know if you have it here, which means when people fall out with their bosses or fail at their jobs, they quietly leave their posts and go elsewhere to garden, sometimes with spectacular results, as here at Studley Royal, created when John Ailerby, Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, was implicated in the South Sea bubble financial crash of 1720 and quietly retired to Yorkshire, where he spent the rest of his life making what I think is the world's most beautiful water garden. Stowe, by contrast, was not a retreat from the political fray, but was actually designed as a political pamphlet. And this was made by a politician, Lord Cobham, who in 1733 fell out with the Prime Minister of the day, Robert Walpole, and was sacked. And these days, a man in his position would post rude things on Twitter, or X, or publish some kind of incendiary insider memoir. But instead, Cobham used his garden to attack what he saw as the corruption at the heart of Walpole's government and to publish his own manifesto. And he really got into this, so by the time he finished, he had 8 lakes, 36 temples, and about 90 statues and busts, every one of which carried a political message. So to give you an idea of the spirit of it, he built a temple of ancient virtue, which honoured 4 Greeks, whom he saw as embodying the qualities so shamefully lacking in the current administration. And opposite that, he built a temple of modern virtue. But this was built, somewhat sarcastically, as a ruin. And the centrepiece was a statue that had no head, but was still clearly recognisable as Walpole. Can you imagine decorating your garden with a headless Trump statue? I mean, would you recognise it? Maybe if it was orange. So this is Kent's Temple of British Worthies. It's a kind of best of Britain gallery showing 16 figures whom Cobham considered worthy of respect. And the chap with a hat here is Thomas Gresham, who founded a college that is still providing free public lectures to this day. All kinds of people there. But this iconography at Stowe was so complicated that it required a guidebook to follow it. And so that gave rise to the very first garden guidebook in English in 1744. So there were those who thought this was all a bit ridiculous, including Francis Dashwood, who created his own landscape garden nearby, believed by many to be in mockery of Stowe. But whereas Cobham's agenda was overtly political, West Wickham was all about sex. So here, among many features in the garden, we see the Mound of Venus, topped by a temple, with below it the distinctively shaped entrance to a dark cave known as the Parlour of Venus. And those banks curved round like two legs, and the space in front was given over to erotic statuary. So I don't think it requires a lot of explication. But a detail I really enjoy is that for many decades afterwards, the cave was used to store gunpowder. Now, this new gardening language worked by allusion to a body of knowledge shared by all educated men at the time, which is a process familiar to anyone here who studied the poetry of Eliot or Ezra Pound, but which no longer really pertains in gardens. And the classics, the classical texts were drummed into every schoolboy of a certain class. And among them, the key texts were the pastoral poems of Ovid and Virgil, such that by the 1740s, garden makers are creating their own fantasy landscapes in the spirit of Virgil, and even occasionally hanging their own verses from the trees. And then comes Stour Head, inspired by the paintings of Claude Lorrain, Nicolas Poussin, and his brother-in-law, Gaspard Duguay, all 17th century French painters working around Tivoli. And Henry Hoare, the maker of Stour Head, he sets out to create his own perfect classical landscape in the manner of these painters, what he calls his own charming Gaspard picture. Or rather, it's a whole gallery of pictures revealed in turn in a series of carefully devised views across the lake, in a manner you may all know from Innisfree. And it's something new. The first new idea is that a landscape should work like a painting, which will give rise to the picturesque, which is a whole sort of codified view of looking at landscape. But more important, I think, is that Stour Head becomes a journey through the emotions. So if you get all the Latin mottos written over the doors, if you get all the allusions to Virgil, that's all good intellectual entertainment. But if you don't, it doesn't really matter, because the sheer visual power of the garden draws the visitor into Hoare's imaginative universe, appealing directly to a place beyond language. And this new informal treatment of landscape becomes so popular that soon everybody wants one, not least because it's so much cheaper to maintain than the kind of gardens we were seeing at Stoke Edith. And the man who gives it to them is Capability Brown, who made over 270 landscape parks in the course of some 30 years. But Brown was a farmer's boy from the north of England, and he had not had that classical schooling that all these gentlemen had had. So what he's creating from the 1750s is a much simpler, substantially less ornamented landscape. And this is actually a designed landscape at Croom, which was his favourite project. But I think we might easily mistake that for unadorned nature. So completely has Brown's aesthetic formed our idea of what's beautiful in natural landscape, or certainly in England, this would be the bucolic ideal. But inevitably, fashions change. And Brown's detractors decided he was just too boring. And they no longer wanted smooth grassy swords and limpid lakes like this one at Petworth. They wanted landscapes that correspond to the latest intellectual and literary fashions. And at this time, everyone is reading the Gothic novel as satirized by Jane Austen in Northanger Abbey. And polite society, it is gripped by the cult of sensibility as promulgated by Rousseau. And we have to remember his favorite hobby was weeping into Lake Geneva. So what they want are these sensitive, melancholic landscapes full of rushing torrents and rocky crags and gloomy woodlands and chilly root houses inhabited by hermits and ivy-clad ruins. Landscapes that look like this. This is Hawkstone Park in Shropshire, or what remains of it. And Britain's art rationalist, Dr. Johnson, visited in 1744 and was terrified. He had to be held down. And of course, that was exactly what was required. Because no landscape was too extreme, too fantastical. Charles Hamilton bankrupted himself, creating a kind of early Disneyland at Paynes Hill in Surrey. It was always designed to be visited. And what it offered visitors was a sequence of unexpected encounters with landscape, which in a way is not unlike the unexpected characters that Alice meets. And this is the highlight, the Crystal Grotto. There's something about it that makes me think of Tim Burton's film of Alice. You know, that it's very beautiful, it's very highly coloured, but there's something quite unsettling. You know, there's something quite sinister about it in a lot of ways. And, you know, even from the original telling, I mean, Alice is quite uncomfortable, isn't she, a lot of the time? Of course, gardens like this cost a fortune to create. Hamilton had to sell up in 1733. But as we move into the thrusting new world of 19th century England, gardens cease to be about ideas. And instead, they're all about plants, because this is the era of the great plant hunters, with thousands of exciting new plants flooding into Britain from all corners of the globe. And two plants especially are beloved of the 19th century, both planted here by the thousand at Cragside. And the rhododendron, I think, was particularly suited to Victorian taste in that it was fashionably evergreen. The flowers were large and gaudy. It was collected with great daring-do from the furthest reaches of empires. It was rare and exclusive, and of course that made it hideously expensive. So these gardens are above all gardens of conspicuous consumption. These new barons of the industrial age had very deep pockets, just as they do here. So Cragside was made for an armaments millionaire who, as a young man, had written a story in which his hero travelled through the Himalayas, exploring forests and lakes and rugged ravines. So at Cragside, he brought this story to life. And he had rock blasted out of the hills and shaped into steps and paths and ledges to make what was in effect the biggest rock garden in Europe. He had the local river dammed to create pools and waterfalls. And he planted the bare hillsides with 7 million trees. All the fashionable new conifers from North America. Yeah. Huge drifts of rhododendrons underneath. So that within 20-odd years, he had created 1,700 acres of Himalayan forest with 40 miles of path going through it. And meanwhile, in Staffordshire, another plant collector, James Bateman, created this fantastical landscape. It's a world tour through time as well as space. So as we go through the garden, we walk from a Scottish glen into a Cheshire cottage. And we come out the other side of the Cheshire Cottage and find ourselves in ancient Egypt, from where we're led to imperial China. And each area is crammed with the latest, rarest plants. So this, for example, this Chinese garden was created expressly to house plants collected in China by Robert Fortune. Most people, however, though, took their inspiration a bit closer to home. So the Rothschilds built their own French chateaux. Friar Park, which later was home to Beatle George Harrison, featured a rock garden in the shape of the Matterhorn, which even had mini tin goats and snow made out of quartz. Yeah. And so this is typical. This is Trentham, and it's illustrated in a book published in 1857 by one Iadvino Brooke, which shows 19 gardens of the super rich. And this is very typical in that it is this grandiose Italian style made in front of the Italian palazzo, but it even had a gondola on the lake. But of course, this kind of planting, these acres of colourful bedding, were not to everyone's taste. And probably no one hated the high Victorian garden more than this man, William Robinson, an opinionated Irishman who really loved a good argument. So Robinson denounces everything we've just seen at Trentham. Those geometric beds set into lawns are pastry cook gardening. That elaborate terracing is railway embankment gardening. The fountains are gigantic water squirts. The topiary amazes monstrosities, but worst of all are bedding plants, pinch plant rubbish, absurd daubs of colour, tasteless and ignoble. And Robinson writes 2 books that changed the course of English gardening, and the first is The Wild Garden, published in 1877, which it introduces a radical approach to gardening. It's not wild as we would know it, but gardening that's permanent and informal, bulbs naturalized in grass, climbers scrambling into trees, use of native plants. I'll see if I can do this. And then he follows that with the English garden, and that, so many things that we take for granted, like the use of informal drifts. What he says is, a garden should arise out of its site and conditions as naturally as a primrose out of a cool bank. What we'd now call right place, right plant, right place. But there's so much of it. He's even writing about covering the soil, about attracting wildlife into the garden, even the use of ornamental grasses. So, a lot of what we think of as current gardening first sees the light of day with Robinson. Anyway, as he's espousing this, he launches this vitriolic war of words on formal garden. Yet, when he finally acquired a garden of his own, which is this, Gravetye Manor, the first thing he did was to make a formal terrace by the house, which is still there. It's an absolutely fantastic garden. It's now a hotel, well worth visiting. And his friend Gertrude Jekyll found this very funny. And of course, it was Miss Jekyll, working with a young architect, Edwin Lutyens, who resolved this dilemma and creates a garden style that many believe has never been surpassed, this supremely satisfying synthesis in which the loose, informal planting beloved of Robinson is contained within a tight geometric framework. And in fact, both Robinson and Jekyll had a very clear idea of what they thought was best in the English garden. And Robinson writes, "Nothing is prettier than an English cottage garden, and they often teach lessons that great gardens should learn." And of course, this ideal of the rural cottage garden, a bucolic myth that grew ever more potent with increasing industrialization, was fueled by popular watercolourists such as Miles Burkitt Foster, whose paintings really did appear on chocolate boxes, on Cadbury's chocolate boxes from the 1860s. And this woman, Helen Allingham, and Beatrice Parsons. And here is a typical representation by Helen Allingham. But what we have to remember is that after 30 years of agricultural depression, that reality would more likely have been holes in that roof and children with rickets and the garden given over to potatoes. And here's a view of Jekyll's own garden at Munstead Wood in Surrey, painted. It's one of 7 that Allingham painted between 1900 and 1903. And it does accurately record Jekyll's method of planting in drifts of colour, but also her attention to the form of plants. Very few of her gardens survive, but paintings like this and Jekyll's own photos and a good number of plans have allowed accurate restorations to be made at Upton Gray, Hestercombe, Barrington Court are the best known, but there are several. But I think this is much more exciting. This is a replanting of Folly Farm, one of her early works, by Dan Pearson. And these are plantings inspired by Jekyll, but not trying to reproduce them. And I think they show just how thrilling those gardens must have been in their day, with that juxtaposition of this powerful architecture with this loose and dynamic planting. And it's this same balance of strong structure and careful manipulation of space, softened by this great froth of flowers, that powers the 2 English gardens that are widely considered to be the greatest of the 20th century. There's Hidcote, that you see here, and was also in our opening slide, which is the ultimate arts and crafts garden, a garden of hedged garden rooms, each one revealing a new delight. And it was begun in 1907, but as you see it today, it's representing the garden as it was in the 1930s, probably in its heyday. It is really remarkable. And then there's Sissinghurst. Another garden of rooms, very much influenced by Hidcote, the creation of Harold Nicholson and Vita Sackville West from 1930, and probably still the most famous garden in England, almost certainly the most romantic. Vita discovered this arrowy tower in a crumbling farmyard in Kent in 1930, fell flat in love, as she put it, within a minute, and determined to make it her somewhat inconvenient, we have to say, home. Though she did keep her teenage sons in a separate building, which I would say had much to recommend it. But to put this in context, in 1930, modernism is taking hold in Europe, as it is here. As she's trying to restore her arrowy tower, Le Corbusier is building the iconic Villa Savoie. So while the modernists are looking for machines for living, Vita instead looks back to this vividly imagined, richly poetic past. She was a great gardener, and she was, I think, the very greatest of garden writers. Much better at that than she was at her poems and her novels, so she would be very sad to hear that. She wanted to be remembered as a poet, and instead what she's chiefly remembered for are her outrageous love affairs, especially with Virginia Woolf, her unconventional appearance, as we can see here, striding around the garden in top boots and pearls, and this extravagantly romantic garden. You see, because her garden was where her imagination really took flight, where, just as Harrington did at Elveston, she could create an appropriate setting for her narrative. She had been brought up in the great Tudor palace of Knowle in Kent. Colossal building, extraordinary. And she loved this with this visceral fervour, but as a woman was debarred from inheriting. And that sense of loss, that sense of injustice, never left her. So Sissinghurst, created as it was round a remnant of Elizabethan castle, became her consolation. It was more than a garden, it was an expression of her sense of self and her sense of loss. And I think that's why, it became so powerful. So what's changed in the 60 years since Vita died? On one level, not a lot. That balance of strong architecture and fulsome planting is pretty much what Britain's most successful designers are still doing today. This is a garden I worked on at Chelsea Flower Show a couple of years ago, inspired by William Morris. And you can see how the designer, Ruth Wilmot, has this wonderfully textured planting held in this tight grid of paving and water rills. While at Great Dixter, admired globally for its sensational successional planting, those floral fireworks are set within a historic arts and crafts structure, largely devised by Lutyens, who joined together two medieval buildings. And even now, more than a century on from Jekyll, the allure of the cottage garden seems entirely undiminished. This is Tom Stewart Smith's take on it, created for this Chelsea just a couple of weeks ago. And his brief was to sum up what it is that the British so enjoy in visiting gardens for the National Garden Scheme, and to create, in a sense, the nation's ideal garden. And here it is. Although we all know that people really visit for the cake. And of course, there have been changes in planting practice. From the 1970s, Beth Chatto championed ecological planting, which is in many ways an extension of Robinson's thinking, but teaching us to think what plants need to succeed rather than just what we want them to do. And this is an image of her pioneering damp garden, followed in 2000 by a gravel garden made in an old car park and never watered. And from the late 1990s, we embraced a naturalistic planting style developed in Germany and Holland since the 1930s, very energetically promulgated by Pete Adolf and Noel Kingsbury. Though, of course, you're already doing it over here, for decades through, by Irma and Van Sveden. Actually, it's a style that doesn't work very well in large parts of Britain because it's just too wet. But the most profound change, I think, has been to think of gardens as havens for all kinds of creatures as well as ourselves. And it's an important message, of course. But in Britain right now, it's being rammed home without thinking about all the other things that gardens need to be, without concern for beauty or emotional resonance or spiritual refreshment, without remembering that gardens also had to be nourishing habitats for people. Which is why I wanted to show you this. This is a wildlife-friendly Chelsea show garden made absolutely in the spirit of Alice, the No Adults Allowed garden, which is now being rebuilt in a London school. And it was designed by children, for children, with a little bit of adult help, but with absolutely no holds barred on their imagination. So its starting point is to be a wildlife-friendly, a sustainable garden. It couldn't include everything the children wanted. There are no crocodiles, for instance, in the but it did manage to squeeze in a woodland with climbable trees and a wetland with huge, scary carnivorous plants and lots of places for birds and animals to hide, and also dens for children, including this rather splendid underwater one, which is only reachable by child-sized slide. And I think it's got some important messages for us, because worrying about our garden's eco-credentials has become a new source of anxiety for many gardeners. And this garden shows that you can garden responsibly, garden for resilience, we would say, but still have fun. Because our wildlife gardens have become often very righteous, very predictable, lacking any sense of beauty or mystery. But this garden shows that even a tiny space can have emotional as well as scientific substance. As I believe that every garden should be an adventure, full of opportunity for exploration, for imagination, and play. And that goes for grown-ups too. So I'm going to end by showing you the two English gardens that I consider to be the greatest significance, of the greatest significance today in England. And curiously, both have been made over the last 20 years by somewhat reclusive gentlemen in the rural backwater of Devon. And one takes its cue from 20th century land art, the rediscovery of the idea that you can express intellectual and philosophical ideas through landscape. And the other is all about natural landscapes and the plant communities they support. And they couldn't be more different in atmosphere and intent. And yet they do have this in common, that each creates a complete and coherent imaginative universe, distinct from the world outside, just like Elveston, just like Stourhead. And this is Plasmataxou, that's Greek for the place between. And physically, it's a valley between hills, but it's also a place between thought and feeling, between myth and reality. And like the 18th century landscape garden, it works by illusion. And the creator is an art historian who believes that gardens are far too important to be just about flowers, that they can speak to and for every aspect of human experience, just as paintings do. And his range of reference is very wide, so he ranges to European art, to Jungian psychology, and also to the gardens of China. And he talks about the gardens of China were described as gardens of mind-heart, that they were supposed to stir the emotions as much as they engaged the intellect. And so this garden explores all kinds of things, the fear of, the inevitability of death, even strangely the joy, the simultaneous joy and terror of childbirth, which is perhaps not what you'd expect an elderly single gentleman to be engaged in. And if that sounds sort of intimidating, it really isn't. You don't have to understand all the Greek references to get the emotional power of it. And it's also full of jokes. And finally, there's this, Wildside, considered by many, as we've heard, to be the most adventurous and exciting garden in Britain today. And here, Keith Wiley ignores all the usual gardening rules and makes new ones, guided by his close observation of plant communities and natural landscapes around the world. So if Plasmataxou can trace its origins to the 18th century, then Wildside belongs to the 19th, in that era of fanatical curiosity about and avid collecting of plants. It's just that he displays them a little bit differently. But what I think is important, in both these gardens, there is a lot of playing going on. Playing with ideas, playing with forms, playing with expectations of scale, playing with juxtapositions of elements. Basically, Keith Wiley has been playing with a digger for 20 years and has created this thing that is extraordinary. And if you come back after the break, he'll tell you how he did it. Thank you.
Thank you, that was amazing. My question is related to how you had said that in the beginning of gardening, there was a lot of elements of healing and apothecaries, and things were created for the purpose of, for medicinal purposes. And I was wondering, did that continue even as gardens became was there both, or was there like then a separation between medicinal gardening and more aesthetic gardening?
It certainly does continue well into the 17th century. So if you look at garden plans there, they are primarily functional gardens, and they're quite often in sections, and whole sections will be devoted to healing gardens. And it's very much, I think it kind of goes on wealth lines. The gardens of ordinary people, and the cottage gardens we came back to, would always have had that element. That was always retained. But for the gardens of the high and mighty, their ornamental value was what was foremost in their thoughts. And they could also afford physicians, whereas normal people had to treat themselves as best they could. So it's certainly there, but it's certainly something that is coming back in a big way, and has been, right, I would say, from the mid-20th century, and from all kinds of, first the desire to create more resilient gardens, and that's part and parcel of it, hugely through the community garden movement that kind of we learned after you guys did. And that's a very, very big part of it. And then I think a whole growing interest in, if I say alternative medicine, but transcultural medicinal practices, and what we can learn from other medicinal and also horticultural growing traditions. But it's certainly strong and something that's growing.
Thank you for such a lovely talk. The question's from up here. Hi.
I'll see you.
In the balcony section, I suppose. I was curious about that slide where you mentioned that the British were starting to garden for conspicuous consumption. And you said that rhododendrons were one of the 2 flower types that they chose. I may have misheard, but was there another type that was also in that painting that you showed us?
Yeah, there were the two things they especially loved were the rhododendrons that came from the Himalayas, sadly not the American rhododendrons, but the things that came from the Pacific Northwest was this whole new range of trees. And you have to remember that in Britain we were very, very poorly endowed with conifers. So these magnificent, huge conifers were absolutely the most fashionable thing. And so those were planted at Cragside by the million, but actually throughout that 19th century era. It's actually the tree to have above all others was a sequoiadendron.
This will be the last question over here. Last question over here before we take a break and come back at 11:30.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this whimsical exploration of this garden situation. I really needed that this morning. Did everybody feel a little therapied by this? I know I wasn't here from the beginning because life has been lifing me, but I especially liked the children's portion of it because I had a really good childhood, and it just really made me think about, like, wow, if someone would have allowed me to just create bigger spaces like that. I was allowed to create, but I would have loved a garden like that, and the importance of bringing those types of creative possibilities to various communities, especially urban communities where it's like very strict and there's not a lot of exploration. Kids need that creativity. They need that natural escape and the natural ability to, be able to, I felt like it was like Peter Pan, like an island that they were on where it was like, oh, look, we get to be free without the adults. And, so it's very healing. I felt very healed by the presentation, so thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you for the work you're doing. This is, it's so important, isn't it? It's so, if they don't love it, then where do we all go?
So, anyway, Wildside is actually, I'm going to move on to that one, because Wildside is a garden that's been created in the last 20 years. And it's actually the manifestation of a dream that, in the spirit of Alice, that has been around, that has been driving my life for really 45, 50 years, really. And it's created by landscapes. I have been in thrall of natural landscapes and plant communities for literally as long as I can remember. And if you think about it, the way that we grow plants in our gardens and the way that we see them in nature bear very little resemblance. And what I try to do is to take landscapes like this that you may not think there is very much that we can learn from that one. This is in South Africa, or the Bluebell Woods of the UK, or the cliffs of Cornwall down in the southwest of England there. All these landscapes, all the watery landscapes of a garden in Italy, Nympha in Italy, where the water is so crystal clear, there's a whole world underneath that water, a world that we can't quite touch, but you can see that there's something exciting happening underneath. Or Crete, where the flowers just create these wonderful displays with the mountains in the background there. Or again, in South Africa, in Sauni Pass. These places have always inspired me, and I think that you can think what I've tried to do is distill the essence of some of these landscapes and create them in the gardens that I have created. One at the Garden House and one at Wildside. Or here in the Mojave Desert in California, where the flowers stretch as far as those mountains into the background there. I mean, what you can't get from that picture is the smell. The smell of those flowers is amazing. Or Bryce Canyon. I mean, the 400-foot sandstone cliffs there, amazing. But part of my gardening story starts at the Garden House, where I came when I finished university, and you can see the size, this rhododendron, absolutely, yeah. Massive rhododendron, but just look at the trees, the trunks. I took all the lower branches off, and it's sort of like a giant bonsai, that plant. And down below that, in true Alice fashion, there is a 16th century walled garden. And it's got a 16th century tower in the middle of it there. And when I came as head gardener there, head gardener of two. You know, I like to big myself up a little bit. But the chap who'd been there had been there for 40 years before. And when he used to weed the garden, it stayed weeded for weeks and weeks. He actually steam sterilized it. And very much to his credit, he allowed me to influence him, and we allowed things to get self-seeding things to come in between the gaps. And so instead of plants growing in blocks of plants, they started to grow into each other and through each other. And you started to get a much more natural-looking feeling to it. You can see it became a very dreamy mix of flowers. And up in the lower part of the top part of the garden, where the soil was quite acid, I mean, the rhododendrons and azaleas grew, and we've got a very wet climate in our part of the UK. It's very, very wet all through the year. We get wet feet, really. And the plants grew much bigger than the books said they should. Clearly hadn't read the books, these plants. These books, actually, these rhododendrons, they're two rhododendrons, these. The books say they will grow 2 feet high. They grew 4 foot high, and they actually grew into each other and through each other. And that felt much more natural to me than actually the way that we tend to grow plants in our gardens. Rhododendrons are often grown in what I call the Chelsea flower show way. You have one there, you have a label in front of it. Plants don't do that. They grow into each other and through each other, and you get a community of plants. And just as an aside, I didn't have to weed that piece of the garden in 20 years that I was there, because they were cutting out the lights to the weed. But that's not the point about it, really. It's about the way they grow together. And here on this part of Dartmoor, where I live, none of the trees that you see there have straight trunks. If there's any tree with a straight trunk in my part of the world, man has had some part in its history. All the trees are multi-trunk, bent, twisted, anything but straight. And if you look at the shape of these trees, look, these are oak trees here, growing a few miles away from where I live. And you then look at the shape of these trees. These are oak trees in Crete, but they're the same sort of shape. But underneath them, you have this mass of cistus plants. The plants just around the corner from this, there were 2-foot-high ground orchids growing. So it was very much like the plants that were growing in a very familiar setting were actually really plants that we were growing in our gardens. And it was like a giant natural garden. And I'd looked at these landscapes before and thought, I said to somebody who had probably seen more plants in the wild than all of us in this room put together. He was an ex-director general of the RHS, the Royal Horticultural Society. And I said to him, why is it that people say that you can't grow plants like they grow in the wild, or you can't create those landscapes? And he said that he thought it was because people thought it couldn't be done. Now, what I hope to show in the course of this talk is maybe that you can. And if you can take ideas from the wild and interpret them, we open up gardening possibilities that are truly, truly limitless. When people say there are no new ideas in gardening, they are wrong. We all could look at a single landscape and we'd interpret it slightly differently. You think how many variations of natural landscape there are. There are truly as many gardening ideas out there as there are stars in the sky. And here in Crete, again, this is a sort of old olive grove. And if you look at the various elements that there are in that picture of the bushes, the evergreen bushes, the trees, the rocks, the way that the plants grow in between it here, you could take that as a template up to Chelsea Flower Show and create a garden, and people would say how sophisticated it is. And really all you've done is taken something from the wild and modify it. You may not want pink flowers. You could have blue and yellow. You could have whatever color you want. But you've taken the basic principles of what you have seen and created something different from it. Now here at the garden house, we had that walled garden that I showed you a little tiny shot of it. And we were starting to get a lot of visitors coming. And when you have grass paths that are only this wide, and you have a lot of visitors in a wet climate, very soon you have no grass left. You have mud. And so what I tried to do was that we expanded. That's the view, that's the rhododendron up there, look, that we were looking at before. I extended out into a field in here. And this, what looks like a tree stump there, that is the chap who was working with me. That's Tom. He was only this high, but he was about that wide. He was wonderful, absolutely amazing. But if he turned round and looked the other way, he would look at this view. And this is a view, if I was on the other side of the world, thinking of a view of England, it would be one like this. I mean, it took me ages to move the church into that particular spot. You can't see any of the village that it's hiding underneath, but it's so typically English or Devon, that landscape, studded with little fields and hedges and little barns. And if I'd put any sort of garden in front of that, and we're here, this isn't Wildside, all right? This is the garden house where I was for 25 years. These are where the ideas for Wildside came from, is that it would have looked strange. A formal garden in front of that view would have not looked right. So what I sort of did was make a very informal garden. And here, I built this little row in, all right? You can see I put some little granite lintels in the wall. And while we were building it, people were there saying, they want to believe it's old. They say, it's awfully small. I don't know how anybody could live in this. I mean, we're building it, okay? So the thing is that it's actually about trying to create the illusion of age in here. And by creating a little ruin, and if you look at this picture and then you look 3 months later, it looked like this. You start to get the flowers coming in, the wild flowers, and then 2 months later again, it looked like this. It's the beauty about this, and then even you can see that it is every color in the rainbow in there. Nature doesn't deal in color clashes. The only color clashes that ever occurred at the Wildside, at the garden house, were all my own work. And nature doesn't have color clashes because it puts the plants, the colors together in much more loose ways. So you can have bright clashing colors, but if they're drifting through each other, they make each other sing. And then in the autumn, you get the light coming through the dried grasses. So the beauty about this style of planting for me was that you can actually create a whole range of different sort of color patterns coming over a long period of time. So for a plant nut like me, I could grow all sorts of plants in the same place. And here, this is South Africa again. And we went down there. I waited 40 years to see the flowers in South Africa. I went down with a group of Americans that we were going there, but we went a week early. And we flew into Cape Town, and we drove, my wife and I, 400 miles up to Wonderland, which is, I say, 400 miles north of Cape Town. We saw these flowers, and then we drove the 400 miles back. We joined up with the American group that I was with, and we drove back up again. 6 days later, or 3 days later, we passed this same place. Not a single flower was out. The thing is, they don't come out unless the sun comes out. You can imagine my frustration being in that van saying, you should have seen this last week. I don't think I'd have been very popular. Anyway, I wanted to try and create the sense of what there was from these wonderful flowers that fill the landscapes in South Africa. And I came back to the garden house and I created this space. And it's got compost underneath and we put sand on the top. And people have said to me before I went to South Africa, why do these flowers flower for such a short time in South Africa, but in England or in our gardens, they will flower for months and months and months. And the reason, I think, is because they grow in pure sand down in South Africa, in very, very poor soils. They just get enough nutrients from the rainfalls to flower for 3 weeks, and then they spend 49 weeks as seeds in the ground. So what I was trying to do was to make the plants think that they were in South Africa in their tops, but England in their roots, you see. 3 months later, it looked like that. I'd sowed seeds and they came up. And did it work? Yes, it did. Because the following year, you can see this bit of grass, afraid it had to go. The whole thing just became a mass of flowers, look. And looking the other way, you can see the detailing that there was in there. And did it work? Yes, it flowered all summer long. So yes, it did work. And you can see on the next one, looking up, I like to fill the whole viewfinder with flowers as far as the eye can see. And then we came down, after 25 years, we decided that it was time that we moved, and we came down in 2004 to this field, to a field like this. That's a 4-acre field. It's 200 yards long, 100 yards wide, and we've got, you can see from that, you've got one set of conditions. And what I was wanting to do was to create the conditions that plants grow in the wild. And plants don't grow in one set of conditions in the wild. They grow in a whole range of different conditions. You know, I think we go to the garden centres or the nurseries and we buy our plants and we bring them back to our gardens and we plant them in one set of conditions that we've got. And when they die, we blame the nurseryman, which has always seemed very unfair. Because very often we've put them in completely the wrong place. And really, what I wanted to do was make conditions to grow the plants the way that they, you know, in conditions that they wanted to in the wild. So we stripped the soil off the whole site, the whole 4-acre site, stripped the soil off and started to shape the ground underneath. You can see that that's what we're doing there. Just making, at this point, my neighbor was rather worried because I hadn't paid him for the field at this particular point. He thought I'd taken a perfectly good field and absolutely ruined it. And you can see there that we were taking the tiny little apple trees that we'd taken out of the ground. And then that view there, 2 years later, the beauty about perennial plants is that they do things very quickly. So 2 years later, it looked like that. A few years later again, it looked like that. It started to mature. You can see the trees are starting to grow up there. And it just became a mass of flowers. And as the trees started to grow, unfortunately, the plants, the perennial plants, get sort of squeezed out a little bit. So I was fortunate in that I could move them to some other part. But I wanted to take the idea of those trees that we've seen, that I showed you, that are not straight trunked around me in my part of the world, is to take the shape of those trees. And you can see that we mirrored that with the shape of these Japanese maples that are here. So you're picking up some of the concepts that there are. Instead of magnolias being one plant, I planted, 5, 6 in the same hole here. And you can see I would have messages left there saying, I'm from the Royal Horticultural Society, and you've planted your magnolias far too close. And I say, who says? Just because the books say that magnolias should be planted at 40-foot spacings doesn't mean it's the only way that magnolias can be grown. Magnolias get very lovely lichen growth, look, up the trunks. So if you're growing lots of trunks, then you get more lichen growth. It's actually really very nice way of actually growing things. It's just, I think we've been in the UK particularly, we have been so busy looking over our shoulders at where we come from in gardening, we've forgotten how to look forward, how to see if we can push the edges of the box a little bit and see if there's something else to do. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You can see, you can again hear, these Katsura trees planted 5, 6 in the same hole, and they create a very natural effect. So that was a part of the garden that we were doing first, and the next areas of the garden that we did were down here. And particularly, I'm going to start down in that direction down there, where we captured the water and we took it down into a sort of valley to recycle all the water that falls on the ground. A view looking the other way, looking at that painted bridge. And in true Alice form, we met some strange people along the way. Here's Roz and I enjoying a nice, we're not enjoying really, it looks like we're suffering lunch while we're being filmed, really. But while they were doing that, this is just how strange some of the people are in Alice as well, as you're meeting. Here, there is the presenter to the program, look, is in a cab with a high visibility jacket and a safety helmet, whilst the cameraman with a $50,000 camera is sitting on the bonnet as it swings around. Now, how crazy is that? And he's laughing about it as well. So, strange people. Anyway, you can see that what we were digging out, we dug out this area down through here, dug it down lower, and you can see 2 years later it started to look like this. You can see the trees have started to grow up at the top there. And a picture taken last year, same view down through at a different time of the year. We'd built some walls and that, but see how the magnolias have now grown up much, much taller. There's sort of 80 magnolias down the bottom down there, and they create this wonderful sort of wood of pink and or a yellow and white in the spring. And looking the other way there, you look up to some stones, some standing stones that we've got there. And here, this is another part of the dream idea. I say Wildside is the pursuit of a dream that has been going for 45 years. I started to grow these conifers 45 years ago. All right, I grew them from seed. They're Picea breweriana, the brewer's weeping spruce. Anybody know brewer's weeping spruce? Its primary branches swoop down like a Chinese pagoda, and the secondary branches just go down like lace curtains for 6 feet. It's one of the most beautiful conifers. When you see a mature plant of it, it's a red letter day if you're a plant person. And I planted 8 of them here. This was going to be amazing, you know, and they would mirror the wisterias, which are hanging down. And then the stones stand up in between stalactites and stalagmites. And it was going to be the pièce de résistance down in the bottom part of the garden there. Sudden oak death gets in the woods around me and wipes out my Picea breweriana.
What?
Picea breweriana.
Now, what?
What killed them? Sudden oak death. It's a Phytophthora ramorum. I have a think. I think we imported it from the States, actually, Phytophthora. Thanks. Anyway, another idea that imported from the States is much nicer. These are erythroniums. If I'm in the dentist's chair, waiting for the dreaded drill, I will relax my mind by thinking of erythroniums. They are my sort of comfort blanket of plants. Erythroniums are these dog's tooth lilies. You get the yellow ones on the east coast over here. Over on the west coast, on the Pacific Northwest, that's where 3/4 probably of the world's population of erythronium species grow. This was a very special moment for me, this one. I'd waited 20 years to go and see the erythroniums in Pacific Northwest. We came round a mountainside hill just at that wonderful golden light that you get at sunset sometimes. And this hillside was covered in these erythroniums. This first time I'd seen them. And they're growing underneath manzanita bushes, which have actually, despite the picture, they're cinnamon-colored trunks. The rocks that are here are granites. They're cinnamon-colored. The bush that's here, the Autostophalos, the manzanita, has yellow flowers, little cream flowers fading to pink, exactly the same color as the erythronium underneath. This was harmony on perfection scale in a space, a few square yards, except the whole hillside was covered in it. It was magical, absolutely magical. And I came back and on a west slope in my garden, I planted some erythroniums underneath, not manzanitas, which won't grow in England, but under another plant with cinnamon-colored trunks. And so every time I look at them when they're in flower in the spring, I can remember that magical moment that I had in California there. And you can see here I took the same concept of it, and I planted them under multi-trunk magnolias, which were flowering pink and white, and the erythroniums flowering pink and white underneath. Or bluebells. Our bluebells are rather different to your bluebells over here. We have the scillas, not the mertensia. But very often you see them growing more amongst coppiced hazel bushes here, or coppiced trees. And I took that concept, and you can see we did it with the erythroniums. Here they're growing under magnolias, look, coppiced magnolias, and actually growing up and carpeting the ground underneath, just forming these carpets of flowers underneath. And you can do it with azalea, with alpines. This is the garden house where I created this. And to truly, I did this, and it's got creeping thymes and rhodohypoxis in here. But to truly appreciate the brilliance of my mind, you have to be 4 inches high to get the reflection underneath the bridge. I couldn't afford any more than a basic Felly bridge when I was there. But I wanted to take that concept, and I wanted to take the concept as here of this is in California, the Tembler Hills in California, which at certain times of the year get covered in wildflowers. I've been 3 times to try and see those wildflowers carpeting the hillside. Missed it every time. It's very frustration, but I did love the way that these seared-colored hills were actually shaping these oak trees. I think it's called oak savanna, this. And when I got back to Wildside, you can see that the shape of the bonsai trees that I had were exactly the same shape as those oak trees. So I shaped the ground in the same shape as those Californian hills, which are very distinctly round-topped. And I put my bonsai trees out, and instead of the wildflowers, I covered the ground with rhodohypoxis, little tiny bulb from South Africa, and dwarf pinks. And I created an imaginary version, a scaled-down version of the Temblor Hills, very much in sort of in the Alice fashion of actually diminishing the scale of things. And you can see that actually it created this wonderful tapestry of pinks and things underneath it. The thing is that, if I just come back to that one, that if the weed grows in amongst these flowers are only 2 inches high. If a weed grows 4 inches high in it, you see it. We found that we were weeding this part of the garden more than any other part of the garden put together. So with time, it started to change over, other things seeded into it, and the tapestry changed, and it became taller. But that meant that I had more leeway with the weeding part of it. So we were able to change. It's got a different type of beauty, and that's fine. I go with the flow. I am never trying to freeze something, hold something in aspic. It's about going and evolving with the garden itself. These are those wisterias that we were looking at before. Those are the brewer's spruce that were, before they died, just beginning to do their brewer's thing. But it's a lovely way of growing wisterias. They're neither standards nor half standards. They're natural-looking shrubs. Really lovely way to grow them. And I was going to make a little copse of them, and I put them on a 4-foot bank, look, and put the trees on the top. And if you've got a 4-foot wisteria on a 4-foot bank, immediately you can walk underneath it and you can start to get immersed in the flowers. And you can see here, when they started to flower, they were really, really very beautiful. And that's a picture just taken a few weeks ago, looking over the top of 2 of the bushes into the remains of the orchard that was there. So we moved up into this area. This is the same area that we were doing while that same television program was filming us about 10 years ago. And here, this is a picture. And you see this mound here, and this one here. They are rabbit droppings.
That's right.
This is the only picture you will ever see where rabbit droppings are an integral part of the picture. What it does is it gives you a sense of scale. This plant is pretty small. Well, Alice size, they're huge. Yeah, no, these are standard sized rabbits. That plant's called Delosperma sphelmanthoides, but it's about what it's growing amongst, okay? It's about what it's growing in amongst the things that you're seeing. These flowers, it's not just the flower, it's what they grow in amongst. See the shadows that these flowers create on the things. It's not just about the babiana that's there in South Africa, it's the way that it creates these shadows on the rocks underneath. I think that's really just as important as the plant itself. You're creating a sense of mood, a place. Down in South Africa, there were succulent trees like these. And then underneath you get the carpet of flowers that's all the way underneath. I wanted to take that concept. I wanted to take the concept of the Mojave Desert where the lightning strikes had killed the shrubs, and you left these trunks sticking up amongst the flowers. I wanted to take Bryce Canyon, where down in the bottom they just formed this wonderful backdrop. Now, you may not think you'd be able to do some of these things, but what I tried to do is here this is our nursery that we had, and during this television program, they gave us 6 months to, they didn't pay us for it, mind. They gave me 6 months to recreate a garden in there. And so we stripped the soil, we got rid of the plants, put some soil down, and 6 months later, it looked like this. And you can see the color of the walls is a nod, if you like, to Bryce Canyon. And there's lots of elements here that are part and parcel. It's places that we visited on holiday, and it's almost as if you put them into a blender and you come up with a smoothie version. It's neither one nor the other, but it's reminiscent of all of them. So it looked like this. You can see the Californian poppies that we put in there, and you can see also the first winter that we made this was very cold, and it killed my cordyline that I'd put in there to the ground and left them as stumps. And my neighbor came along and he said, "That looks awful, Keith." He said, "Do you want to cut them down?" He said, "It looks like a fire's just gone through there." I said, "Brilliant. That's just the effect I'd like to have." It's the effect of the plants emerging phoenix-like from the ashes. In actual fact, they fell over and those stumps, and they've grown again. They've grown again since, but neither here nor there. And I tried to catch the idea of the light coming through things. You can see it actually became very floriferous. And while it still had light there were lots and lots of, it really flourished with no shade and things coming in. And now, a few years later, those cordylines that were cut to the ground in 2011 have grown back up again, and they've created a very different sort of feel. So this is about evolution and just sort of processing the effects of time on the garden as well. And there's a wisteria arch comes all the way around, or wisteria pergola. And it's about plants growing into each other and through each other. This grass, which is a squirrel-tail grass, and the eryngium here, they're lovely in their own right, but together they look even more beautiful. A lily looks fantastic, this tiger baby's lily coming out of a Nacella tenuissima there. And this little plant in true Alice fashion, this is 9 inches high, this lily. Lilium Pricei Formosanium var Pricei. It has flowers the size of a regal lily, which are normally on stems this big, but this is only 9 inches high. I always thought it looked ridiculously out of proportion. But then I grew it amongst a little allium that was 9 inches high, Allium palens, and for the first time in my life, it looked right. Looked like it was meant to be. And I think that was really, I've since lost it, but there you go. And I had the stumps and things coming up through it in this part of the garden, and these pots that were here. In actual fact, these pots create quite a Mediterranean feel in this garden. When this television program went out, I had a lady from the Cotswolds in England, which is an area of England where they have lovely, it's picture postcard England, north of Bristol area. And they have sandy coloured walls. And she'd bought a container, this was a New Zealand lady, she'd bought a container load of New Zealand coiled pots in to the Cotswolds, and she'd sold all the sandy-coloured ones to the people, to the residents of the Cotswolds. But the terracotta ones, nobody wanted them because they clashed with the colour of their houses. So she said, "Would I like some?" I said, "Yes, please." And she gave me 5 of these Alibaba pots, this sort of size. And I said, "I think I could sell some of these for you." So I said, "I'll take another 4 or 5 of them." And I made the mistake of putting them in the courtyard garden, because as soon as I put them in the courtyard garden, I knew I had to buy them myself. It ended up costing me. But never mind, they are really wonderful the way they create the atmosphere down there. Or standing stones, this is one that was in the hedge, just looking at a lovely slate standing stone. Or that Bryce Canyon, that bottom of the Bryce Canyon. This is the bottom of Bryce Canyon, but I love the way that the light strikes the sand and lights up the trunks here. I could live with that as a garden, just in its own right. You could grow flowers coming out of the bottom if you wanted to. But what I did is actually these trees have the same sort of trunks as those there, and therefore, I had no idea they would do this, but they have actually created that sense of that in the courtyard garden there. And the seats, and this is a seat that a volunteer makes for me, all of my seats. But these trees, this is Elaeagnus quicksilver. Anybody who's grown Elaeagnus quicksilver, I know people who've banned it from their gardens because it spread so rapidly. But what I did is we allowed some of the trunks to grow and turn it into trees. And it forms sort of token olive trees for me. It gives me the effect of olive trees. So looking down through there into the courtyard garden looks like you're looking down into the Mediterranean. So the last part of the garden to be built was this piece up here. And it was part of it was based on this picture that somebody sent me from Northern Ireland. And he was a massive collector of agapanthus and crocosmias. And he just shoved them together in stock beds out the front of his garden. But I loved the color combinations that there were there. And I thought, I know, I could make a piece of garden from that. And so I did. And I had 100 different types of agapanthus, and in amongst them, I put grasses. Because agapanthus are very stiff, aren't they? They don't move in the breeze, they just stay there. But grasses, any breeze, and they move. And it's like watching a field of barley when it's in flower. It's just the ripples moving all through. And it adds a new dimension of excitement and interest to the garden in amongst the blue of the garden itself. You can see the agapanthus and the grasses form this wonderful sort of double act. And then when you get the light coming through grasses, you get magic. If you're going to grow grasses, grow them somewhere where the September sun can come through them in the evening. You can put real magic into your garden if you get golden evening light flooding through grasses. And these are dioramas, actually, the wand flowers. Beautiful, covering the ground in here. In another part, Michaelmas daisies later in the year with the taller grasses, the taller miscanthus. And here, just to give you some idea of scale, I mean, this is very difficult. It's very difficult to photograph Wildside to give you the sense of scale. I've moved about 150,000 tons of soil and stone to create Wildside. It was a flat field. Now it has 40-foot high banks. In the back, there's 40-foot high banks there. What it's done is created a whole range, I say, of different habitats for growing plants. These birch trees are growing on the original level. So everything below that has been dug out, everything above it has been added. And what we did is this piece of the garden over here was actually like this. This is in a fairly raw state. This was going to be, when I dug it out, there's the natural level, somewhere up there. I dug this down. This was going to be a natural swimming pool, you see. And on this slope over here, I was going to build a pirate's house on stilts. And in front of it, I was going to put 15 tons of nice soft sand, and I was going to have my own beach in front of the pirate's house next to the swimming pool. And I thought that the kids would love it, you see, my grandchildren. In actual fact, they weren't interested really, but then never mind. And then I saw a picture in a book of, we created a sand bed here. This has got sand underneath it, and we started to grow some plants in it, and it would look really nice. And I saw this picture in a book. And it's a picture of South Africa flowers growing with water just in the middle. And overnight, that idea that I told you about the swimming pool and the pirate's house, I had told so many groups over the years that this was what it was going to be, that in my head, it was a reality. It was already there. And I saw this picture, and overnight, I abandoned that idea. And I felt so proud of myself that I could do that, that actually I could change my mind. I don't do things by plan. It's all by instinct, it's all by feel, it's all about feeling what is right in the landscape, how this landscape responds to me, how I plant it. So this one just fed the idea in that we could change my swimming pool into something else. So there is Roz, standing there rather reluctantly, acting as a scale. And at this point, unfortunately, I mean, she passed away. She was fully aware of the idea that we wanted to, that the piece of the garden that I showed you with all the flowers at the garden house, that was a piece of the garden that we were very sad to leave behind. And so I decided that we'd actually turn this piece of a garden into a tribute garden for her and open it up, hopefully in the time as a cancer respite area. It's because it will have, it's a very special area of the garden. So I wanted to take the concept here of the African garden that we had and to sort of, in a way, make it a little bit more sophisticated. By these are flowers of South Africa. See how the different number of plants you will get in each square meter of space and how it's actually really very subtle. And I wanted to take that concept. And here, this is where we have actually tried to do it. We've got, this is the tribute garden now. It's only just in the process of being developed. But you can see we've got the rocks and the water coming in here. We're starting to get some of the flowers coming. You can have, in true Alice style again, these are little tiny moreas. They look like iris, but they're only 4 inches high. But together, they can create this wonderful tapestry. This is in South Africa, unfortunately. But this is the thing I'm trying to create there. And you will actually get, on these rocks here, you can see that actually we started to grow the rhodohypoxis again, that little tiny bulb. And it will start to cover the ground eventually like this, just 2 inches high. And looking up through here, there's a series of waterfalls that come right up through. And you go from the little spring, a stream that's there, look, with a spring that's coming out of the side of the hill, down to the Oxbow Lakes in the bottom. In a way, this is just like a sort of miniaturization of a whole water system. But it's not necessarily, it is that, but it's not the reason it's doing that. It's aesthetic, so that you can actually grow the plants on it. And on the stony banks, I'd be able to grow things like the Erythronium heleni that I like. And just coming towards the end here, this is one of the little valleys that we were opening up. And as the trees have grown up, they have formed, and I built the building there, which will be dedicated to respite use. This little valley would just become a mass, a little green oasis in here. It's under birch trees. It'll just become mossed up. You can see what I did is we built this. These are actually with peat blocks. And before you throw your hands up in despair, I bought these peat blocks in from Sweden in 1985. They've waited 35 years in storage for a space to be used. They're Rolls-Royce peat blocks, and they just become mossy and turn green. So this whole little valley would just become green, and you'll be able to grow really special plants in it. And the dream is still going. Here, this is one of the canyons that we've done. Those banks are 25 feet high here. Do you see these little shrubs at the top? They're cistus, and now they've grown into this look. It's a landscape in cistus in its own right. These are the biggest cistus I've ever seen growing in a garden, and they're growing because of the conditions that you're creating are just exactly the same. But I wanted to take, when I grew up as a kid, I grew up in the Mendips, where you have these tumble-down walls in lieu of hedges, and you see the verges that you get in between. I want to try and create that memory again of my childhood, but instead of grass, grow wildflowers in amongst those verges. And I will have, in that valley where the cistus is, I will have a stream coming in, and this, I will build another one of these under the water, and the water will come up from underneath it as if it's coming up from the underworld, and it'll fill this valley, and I'll grow water lilies all the way down through it. Or else I might just dream of the Drakensberg. And on that point, thank you very much.
Many thanks to Keith. I'm sure many of you are putting it on your bucket list like I am at this point. Do a visit. We have time for questions, so...
You're bringing in plants from South Africa and the Western United States. Do you have any concerns about trying to focus on native plants?
In the UK, that is not, our flora is not as special as your flora that you have in the States. Invasive species have been around, I mean, it's not an issue with us really. It's much more of an issue over here, particularly, about your native plants. It's not, our whole landscape in the UK is already being completely, it's not an original landscape at all. It's all been going back so long. It's been manipulated for ages. It is really not an issue at all in the UK, native plants. There's talk about Spanish bluebells spoiling the bluebell woods that you saw. But that's very, very little. Our woods are already they're already, the species that we have are already so well adapted to our wet climate that invasive species don't really have a chance of getting a foot in. I mean, they're already, we don't have very sensitive areas like you do in the States or in South Africa. So we've had centuries of bringing plants in, and it's been a world center place, a sort of congregating place for plants. There's vast numbers of plants in the UK, in the nursery trade and around. So yeah, it's not an issue in the UK. I appreciate it is over here. Thank you very much.